tremendous November. No part, no loss of credit, I should say, is due to our speaker this evening, who came to Ann Naker and me, about 3-4 months ago now, at least that, and said, hey, I've got an idea. Don Brzezinski is an authority on the U.S. Marine Corps. Not just their recent history, but the complete history of the Corps going back to colonial times. This oldest armed services in our country's history has a rich history, and they celebrated their 235th anniversary this month, and we celebrated it on November the 10th with a historic reenactment that Don's brigade took part in, and we're sort of center stage in. We had kids from Brookfield Elementary here that day, and a number of hardy folks who came out on a rather cold and damp day. It was damp. And saw the reenactors and an incredible exhibit of Marine memorabilia and uniforms that was in Town Hall. And here in the church, we cut the birthday cake for the Marine Corps with a big old sword. And it was a wonderful celebration, and also solemn, because it was the day before Veterans Day. We remembered those members of the armed forces, Marine and otherwise, who have served this country and who have given their health and their lives in the service of our country. But Don, in addition to being an authority on the Marine Corps and a reenactor, is an incredibly accomplished journalist, an award-winning journalist, and an author. And he is in the process of publishing a book on the Marine Corps entitled, let me get this right, it's the Early Leathernecks.
Well, I changed it to the First Leathernecks.
The First Leathernecks. And it will be an important book for, I think, many people in our country who don't realize the rich heritage of this very, very special corps. And so tonight, what he's going to do is talk about the history of the Marine Corps as it is so appropriate for us who live in Michigan. And I don't want to take any more away from his story. It's important, and you've listened to me blather on enough. What I would like you to do is warmly welcome an important Marine historian, Mr. Don Brzezinski.
I'm going to do this rather casually, so I'm going to sit down. After 9 years of research, I'm a little tired. But what this is this is the Marines on the Great Lakes. A lot of people don't realize that the actual, there actually was a Marine Corps, 1,200 men at that time. And so we're going to follow them to see what they did on the Great Lakes, and primarily during the War of 1812. And then we'll hold questions to the very end. The first flag that you see is the 15-star flag. The country was all of 36 years old, and 2 more states were added, Ohio and Kentucky. And as we look at the Marine uniform to come in 2 more slides, you'll notice how the Marine uniform was actually was to emulate the flag. It's the only uniform, even to this day, that actually has red, white, and blue. It has blue coats, it has white belts, just like today they wear, and it also has the red trim, also with yellow trim. So this is the Marines in the frigate Navy. That's what they primarily served on back then. They weren't known so much for land usage as they were to be the sea soldiers on the ships. They were supposed to provide firepower on the ships. They had 50 men on each large ship, along with a drummer and a fifer. The drums were important because with all the 24 and 32 pounders going off, you couldn't hear verbal commands, and so, but they did have ears to know the commands by drum. Here's a typical uniform from the War of 1812. You see the shako. It's a very Napoleonic type of uniform. Napoleon had set the style, and you know, when you have a good designer, everybody follows that designer. So the shako is what they call the cover of the helmet, and it was raised, not as high as the infantry, but a little shorter, so that they could move around below there. So it actually was 7 inches higher as opposed to 9 inches high. And it was actually straight up like that to absorb saber cuts as a cushion. And then it has a cord that you see in the front, and that was to act as a chin strap when they did boarding parties or amphibious assaults on the beach. And they had a red plume in the center, and the sergeants would have their plume off to the side, so the officer could tell that that was an NCO. And the plate that you see on the front of the shako didn't have Semper Fi back then. That wasn't invented until later. It had Fortitudine, which was Latin for courage. And they were very courageous men. They also had wigs. They were the only ones to wear, I shouldn't say wigs, we wear wigs. They had powdered hair. And they actually formed 2 lines, and they would reverse one of the lines, and actually they would powder each other's hair. And it was a combination of soap, water, and flour. And we joke around, us reenactors, that when it rains and the sun comes out, we turn into a muffin. Had all the ingredients right there. So we were a short thing, and then ours are just in the back, and it has a cue in the back, which is tied with black leather and a bow. You see the high collar, that was a fashion back then, and they also have a neck stock, which is made out of a diamond patterned leather, and this is where the Marines to this very day are called leathernecks. So my book, when it comes out this time next year, may have a leatherneck on the cover. We had the cross belts, one to hold the ammo box and the other one to hold the bayonet. And you see the white belts. And the uniform was based on a chasseur's uniform with the type of yellow braid. The musket that they hold is a sea service musket. This is about 8 inches shorter than a regular musket. And these were generally British Tower muskets, because the British muskets were very, very well made, and they had good interchangeable parts, and they're very reliable. You see the long gaiters that they're wearing from over the shoe up to the bottom of the knee, and this was primarily for amphibious assaults to keep the sand and the water out of your shoes. So this is what our airmen look like today, and in the summertime, they would have a thing we call the summer establishment. These were based on the summer solstice or fall equinox, however those 2 words are interchanged, and that's when they would change their uniforms into either into a summer uniform or a winter uniform. So this is obviously summer because they're not wearing their gaiters on their caps. So it's a pretty good rendition of those 2 Marines in the front. With the red plumes, those are my sons, and I have 3 sons that are Marines, and we're growing more. So it's a pretty good rendition of how you can see the sleeve rendition. They didn't have anything like we have today, like chevrons, but eventually those things that you see on the sleeve, the 2 yellow ones, probably were the predecessor for moving those stripes later in the years. You can see the leather neck pretty well. And some of them have the long muskets. But Eric in the front, he has the long musket, and Aaron on the right has the short sea service musket. You see the difference. And with the difference in a few pounds makes a big difference when you're marching through Tripoli, like 800 miles. This is one of Colonel Waterhouse's paintings, and he's agreed to let me use 200 of his paintings matter of fact, they're building a museum for him in Washington. He was a combat artist for the Marines. He was wounded at Iwo Jima, and he has made a number of beautiful paintings that will be featured in the book. So the book will be highly colorful. This is the first landing, first amphibious assault. These are Continental Marines, where they had their hat turned up on the side. It was a round hat, and they were actually wearing green uniforms at that time. So here they are landing at Nassau in the Bahamas to take power from the British. This is the Marines also fought at the Battle of Princeton, which was a battle that was fought in the cold, and they also suffered at Valley Forge. They were actually taken off their several ships in Philadelphia Navy Yard and used in the battle at Princeton. This is their most famous beginning in time for the Marine Corps. This is the shores of Tripoli. This is where they actually marched from Egypt all the way to Tripoli, somewhere around 850 miles. And there was only a few of them. I think there were 7 or 8 of them, and the rest were mercenary troops, Greeks and Christians, and a number of. Eventually, the army came to about 1,200. And the reason that they did this long march was kind of unusual. You know, it says in their song, "through the shores of Tripoli," and you would think that they're coming off the ships, but actually they marched through North Africa. And the reason that they wanted to attack this town, and they were going to replace the ruler in Tunisia, because at the time the people in North Africa, I guess you would call them Muslims today, they had a thing where they captured Christians, and over 1 million of them, and this was condoned by the Muslim faith. And they were sold into slavery. The men would work in construction gangs or on ships, building harbors and things like that. And if the women were blue-eyed and blonde-haired, they were sold into harems. So they had the ship Philadelphia came into that Algeria area because the United States did not want to pay tribute. All the other countries were paying tribute so that their ships could continue commerce in the Mediterranean. And the United States and President Jefferson said, we're not going to put up with that. So they tried to replace the ruler, and Philadelphia, one of the big frigates, ran aground, and they captured close to 500 American sailors and Marines. And so that's why this march was done, to free those people who were going to be sold into slavery. As a matter of fact, when they did free the Marines and sailors, already 30 of them had died from starvation. And that was led by a General Eaton that you see with the chef bow and the red feather there on the right at 1 o'clock. This is a slide of the Marmaduke sword. And I gotta find my little, there it is. The Marmaduke sword is still used today with this type of curvature. And this was presented to Lieutenant O'Bannon from the Marines at Tripoli by one of the men who was going to replace the ruler of Tunisia. And it's called a Marmaduke sword because that was with the Mamelukes in Egypt, who were fighters, mercenary army. That's what they carried. And to this day, the Marines carry on this tradition, and their officer actually has a curved Marmaduke sword, very similar to this. So Marines are very big on their traditions. This is a boarding helmet that you normally don't see very often. This is what they actually would wear when they were boarding or repelling boarders, because the ships would close together and they would try to take the ships from each other. And you see those little metal straps and these little curvatures on each, I think they're on 3 or 4 sides. And this was to stop the saber cuts. This is a very important map, showing a lot of people, like when I was in grade school, they didn't even touch on War of 1812. I didn't even know there were battlefields in Michigan. And there's quite a few. There's Frenchtown over here, which is another name for now Monroe. It's now we have a thing called Frenchtown Township, and that was a pretty good fight. Was a loss to the Americans, and now that's going to be designated into the first federal military park that's going to open in Michigan. That will be happening next year. And then here's the Battle of the Thames that actually came after Perry's victory at Lake Erie. We're going to talk about Lake Erie a little later. This is where the battle actually took place, Put-in-Bay, 20 miles east of Monroe. And then after that naval fight, which we captured a British squadron, or they would maybe even call it a fleet, because there was quite a number of ships. That was the first time in American history that a British squadron or fleet was actually captured. It was unheard of, especially since the British had 1,000 ships and we only had about 30. After that battle, then they chased the British and the Indians at the Battle of the Thames. This Frenchtown was a massacre. The Americans had lost, and the reason I'm backing up a little bit because I'll tell you what happened at the Thames, and that is the after the battle, the American wounded and the officers couldn't be transported, and the British were actually located right. The British were located right over here at Fort Malden, near Amherstburg, just south of Windsor. And that was a major strategic fort for the British, right across the river from us. And they had a British officer there called General Hamilton, and they call him the hair buyer. And he would buy, from the Indians, he would buy American scalps for $20 a pound sterling. So that was his little business. And when the Americans were defeated there, they had about 20 or so wounded, and the British went back to Fort Malden, and they said they would transport the wounded next morning. And the Indians got into the liquor that they found in some of the French huts, but this was basically a French village, and they massacred all the American wounded. And supposedly, we don't have proof, they also said that they roasted some of the American officers in the fireplace at some of the huts. So that became the battle cry. That became Kentucky troops fought there. Matter of fact, the state of Kentucky furnished probably the most troops in the War of 1812. Mostly eastern Kentucky was probably the most developed. And 12 counties in western Kentucky are actually named for some of their officers who were roasted or killed at River Raisin. So then that became the battle cry after for the Battle of the Thames, because when they attacked at that battle, they saw that the British were in open formation. That means they were not shoulder to shoulder; they were 3 feet apart. And the Americans saw this as an opportunity. So they mounted. They had mounted infantry from Kentucky, and you'll see a picture of them coming up. And so they just rode right through them, and the battle was over in 15 minutes, especially after their war cry, remember the raisin. So it was a payback on a big time. And also the Indian leader who was in charge of the Confederation of tying up all of these Indian tribes together, Tecumseh, he was killed at that battle. And supposedly one of the Kentucky troops, you know how they used to sharpen their razors on the leather in the old days? They supposedly made leather straps from the skin off of Tecumseh's legs. So this is a very important map because actually the frontier was like right there. Toledo, Perrysburg, that was the edge of the thing, and this was all British up and through here. This was called Upper Canada, and this was called Lower Canada. So Canada was basically in two areas, and from Montreal west was called Upper Canada. And I have a copy of a secret memo, which Lorraine or some of the staff can make copies of this later on if you come back to the museum later. This is a secret memo that I found. It was found in Portugal, and I came across it, and it's from Lord Bathurst, who was in charge of colonial affairs, but they consider this a colonial area. And this memo calls for the dismemberment and containment of the United States. So King George had a real fetish about losing to the Americans. He never got over it. And they actually saw the Americans as a terrific economic force that was actually going to hurt England big time. So what Lord Bathurst wanted to do is he wanted to cut off everything from here across. In other words, he wanted them to capture Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, pretty much all of New England. And this was going to be the dividing line. And he talks about how they're going to do that, and what troops he's sending over, and all that. And the reason for this is because they wanted a land route to Quebec and to Montreal. Because in the wintertime, the St. Lawrence would freeze up, and you had no way to get supplies and equipment and men over there. And then the other part that they weren't going to do, and the Battle of Lake Erie prevented them from doing that. You see it says Michigan Territory, and then there's also the Indiana Territory, which also comprised Illinois, and Michigan Territory also combined with Wisconsin. And this was all going to be Indian land. This was going to be given to the tribes as a buffer so that the United States could not move any further westward. Later on, I'll show you where the three theaters were, how they were going to attack and do this. I can touch on them briefly now, but I'll get into a little bit later. But one of the attacks were going to be down Lake Champlain, and of course this was a major highway, even from 35 years ago when Arnold and during the American Revolution they came down that way also and were defeated at the Battle of Saratoga. Then the other one was they're going to come into Washington area, and the Americans made a mistake over in here. This is Niagara on the Lake, right over here. Some of the troops from upstate New York, militia, Forsyth Rifles, I believe, they got a little rowdy and they actually burned the town of Newark. So that 1812 was the beginning of we're starting to see warfare onto civilians, which was unheard of before. American Revolution didn't do that as much as the War of 1812 did. But the real kicker was when the Americans captured York, which is now called Toronto. Toronto is a French word. They burned the Parliament buildings there. And the Americans claimed that the reason they burned the Parliament buildings, they had, House of Lords and House of Commons, very miniature style, like from England, and because they saw an American scalp behind the speaker's desk. And the British scholars, they claimed that that was the speaker's wing. But I think that an American soldier would know the difference between a scalp and a wing. So they burned the Parliament, and then the British retaliated by burning Washington City. But since we burnt their government buildings, then that was the real reason for burning, which is now the White House. And then the other major thrust was going to be from New Orleans. That was actually one of the major reasons, because that would contain the United States for westward expansion. And they knew that New Orleans was mostly Creoles and Spanish and a whole polyglot of a lot of different peoples, and they didn't think they would be loyal to the United States. So this was considered, this movement, this campaign was to lock off New England, like I mentioned, This was a feint, also a little bit of retaliation for York. And then this one was going to contain the United States. So you can see they really had it all pretty much figured out, you know, our curvature. But we didn't succeed. This is the battlefields in the Detroit area, which unfortunately they don't teach in school system like they should. We see the Battle of Monongahela here, Brownstown. Monongahela was an Indian village, and Detroit was captured. And this is Sandwich, which is still called Sandwich. And over here is Windsor. And then there's Amherstburg over here. And if you ever go on Fighting Island, the reason this is called Fighting Island over here is because there's still entrenchments. You can see sand in the dunes where the British had set up to repel American invaders. So Detroit was a real battleground. And this actually, the warfare started over here because the British Hull invaded Canada, and they were very afraid of the Indians. The British knew that the Americans were afraid of the Indians because they were, you know, known for scalping and for desecrating bodies once you were killed, and you can't actually bury a person if they're all in pieces. So they were hauled back. Detroit surrendered. It was a trick. They marched their British and Indians back 3 times in a big circle, and when he finally did surrender his 1,200 men, he realized he surrendered to 1/3 of those forces because he got tricked into it. So that was the battleground for the Detroit area. So that was the western part. And this was the battleground for Frenchtown, like I mentioned about the River Raisin. It was kind of an unusual battle because the Americans were actually winning on that side, and the other side had surrendered. So it was in 2 wings, and it was a very poor general. Winchester, I believe, he was down across the river on the other side, and it was just very poorly led. It was a winter battle, and they reenact this every January if you ever go down to Monroe, Michigan. This is one of the largest forts in Perrysburg, Toledo area, and this is the largest fort in North America that's sustained by the Ohio Historical Society. And it's a 10-acre fort. It's all been rebuilt. It's a beautiful fort, and there's cemeteries and monuments all over the place. The British laid siege to this twice. From over here, they bombarded, and over here they had another gun emplacements. And then they had these, see where it says traverses? They had longitudinal traverses, and then they also had vertical traverses. And these traverses were to stop the 24 and 32 pounder cannonball. That's a big cannonball. Because a cannonball, when going through a fort, could take out hundreds and hundreds of men with one shot. So these traverses were like mounds, and so that the cannonball would actually shoot up and get out of the way of the troops or the tents and stop from making mayhem. And the Americans had were paying each American private 1 gill of whiskey for every cannonball they could retrieve. So there were a lot of drunken troops, and there were a lot of collection of cannonballs going on in that fort. This was a picture of Marine Sentry freezing over here. They had watch coats that they gave to every 6 Marines, and this is one of the Waterhouse paintings of building of the ships at Presque Isle or Erie, Pennsylvania. And the United States is blessed with a lot of good oak and these made for great ships. The reason why Old Ironside was called Old Ironside is because one of these sailors, I don't know if it was British or American, but he noticed a British cannonball bouncing off because the size of the ship were 8 inches. One there was a number of wood, but the one that were facing the outside of the wood was live oak, and these were very strong compared to the British ships, which were pretty much rotten by weevils and worms and what have you. This is, we serve on the Constitution at the Marine Guard, along with one of our sister detachments at Charleston Navy Yard in Boston. And this is, I took this picture down in the Sea Islands of Georgia. And this is how they would actually build the ships. They would go down there and you see these kind of things like these arms, all of these things were actually shaped by the wind from the Atlantic. So this could be a good chunk of wood to support a gun deck, and this would be a good chunk of wood. So all of these curvatures were wind-made, so to speak. So it was very interesting. And it would take about 10 acres of wood to actually to build one American frigate. And this is the strongest wood. It took forever to saw. And there was a business called live oaking. And here's some of the American fleet. We reenact. We actually have ships, and we do this whole thing. I mean, it's pretty realistic. And this is, I believe, this is the Brig Niagara. And these are most of the ships were sloops that had not as many cannons on board. So all of this stuff is being recreated, and hopefully for the bicentennial we'll actually recreate the Battle of Lake Erie like they did back in before the Civil War. This is actually where the battle was fought. This was the American harbor at Put-in-Bay, Ohio, and this is the part of the monument there with the International Peace Tower. And the battle was actually fought over there, about 20 miles west of Monroe. And it was a terrific fight. Our lieutenant that we portrayed, we are Brooks Detachment, and our lieutenant is Brooks, and he was hit by a 32-pound cannonball. He got hit at the hip, which pretty much cut him in half. And he was taken below deck, and he asked Perry, Commodore Perry, to finish him off as a mercy kill. And Commodore wouldn't do that. As a matter of fact, anybody who stood next to Perry got shot or killed. So the battle went on, and when the Americans did win, then Lieutenant Brooks expired, and he was the first Marine to win a Congressional Medal. So this is what we look like. This is an officer's uniform. They have a chapeau. Naval officers wear this too, and it really is a blessing in disguise because being on a ship, it's all based on the wind. So when you have the chapeau, it actually is telling you if you're facing the wind or if it's knocking your head off, you're against the wind. So this is a kind of a wind indicator, which is kind of a cool thing. And you see the RAP Q, and an officer would have, he's a lieutenant, so he would have a silver, that's an original, and a captain would have a gold one. And you can pretty much see the uniform. And he also had a red sash. And red sashes came, even in the Civil War, they became very useful because that's how they carried a wounded or a dead soldier, officer off the field. They used his red sash as a sling. And to this day, the Marines still wear the white belts. And you can see the French knot that's over here. And this is the chin strap the guy was telling you about. Very elaborate uniform. This is a typical fight. The Marines would actually, they provided the firepower on the ship. So they're actually shooting, they would actually aim at the officers. The British thought that was very unsporting of them. And they would also lob grenades. They had powder monkeys that were bringing the powder up from below deck, and they had a little square opening, maybe about 8 inches square. And this is where they would pass the powder up to the powder monkey from down below. So the Marines were trying to almost lob a grenade into that magazine, because once the magazine blows up, that's the end of that ship. So they would actually load and do everything from there. They were also trained to man these big cannons. The cannon crew got wiped out. They knew how to load 24, 32 pounders. And they also did the amphibious assaults on the ship. When these ships were getting bored with some of the larger frigates, they would actually put up like a U-shaped net, like this, over and the side and the other side. And they would have these long pikes, and they would try to tickle the Marines or the British get them off the net, because they would try to capture the ship by boarding. This is what the Marines would fight from. This is the maps of the Constitution, and these are called the fighting tops. And you could get, these are very strong. You can see how thick that is. And you could get close to 30 men on there. The Marines used to have 6-man fire teams, and the Kentucky and the Pennsylvania guys would have their Pennsylvania or Kentucky rifles. And they would always, to this day, the Marines are known for their marksmanship. And they would have one man do the shooting and the other 5 would be doing the loading. You know, the loading would take time. And they were expected to load about 3 muskets 3 times a minute. So that's called the fighting top. And that was where they would direct their firepower onto the enemy. Here's a good example of the typical firefight. And you can see when we're getting the grenades are actually carried up in this little kedge barrel that had a rope on it. And here's one Marine loading. Here's one taking advantage of the mast. And here I think he's getting some grenades ready. You can see this one, he's looking for a hatch that he can throw that grenade into. That's a typical fight.
The fences are open? It's open around there?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They have no protection like today's Navy ships. Yeah, there's just you have to watch your step and know when the ship is rolling, so you don't fall off that top. This is another example of a fighting top. The British would, their theory was to capture the ship, and the French had a different theory. The British theory was to knock this down, to get that ship demasted, and they would do that with 24 or 32 pounder cannons. And the French, when they fought the French in the Napoleonic times, the French, their theory was to actually destroy the ship, and they would actually shoot below the waterline to sink it. I think the British had a better theory because you can always replace the mast and you got to ready because the ship takes a long time to build with all that rope and all that sawing. Here's one of the fights from the Constitution, and they're closing in. The American ship is closing onto the British ship over here, and here's Captain Hull. He was a little overweight, and supposedly he ripped his britches in that battle. And here's your Marines loading, and then they would step forward and actually fire. And this is Lieutenant Bush, who's asking the captain if he should we board her, sir? As soon as he asked that question, there was a British Marine who shot him in the forehead. This is the Holy of Holies in Annapolis. This was the flag that flew on the Niagara at the Battle of Erie. It's at Bancroft Hall, and it's in a very the most respected artifact in the entire school. Don't give up the ship. It was all handmade, as you can see. You can tell by the lettering. And this is the Brig Niagara. This is the ship that actually is recreated. This is the ship that actually won the Battle of Lake Erie. I think we'll have some handouts later on the Battle of Lake Erie that's going to be featured in my book. And it was kind of an unusual battle. Perry had a problem with the other commander, Elliott. Elliott got passed over to command this battle. So Elliott, as a result, had an attitude. So during the battle, Elliott was actually in command of the Niagara. And Perry started off with, he was on the larger ship with most of the Marines on the Lawrence, which was almost totally destroyed. It took all the hits. And so then later on, lackadaisical, Niagara came up and Perry dismiss this. I mean, it looks could kill. He could kill Elliot right there on the spot. Because where was he all this time, not helping him? And so Perry transferred the flag to the Niagara, and then the Niagara broke the British line and fought cannon broadsides from both sides and defeated the British. You can see the size of these ships. This is the Constellation in Boston Harbor that we go play on, and those were like the battleships of their day. You can imagine, this is taken from a World War II duck that I was riding in, so the duck was only like a foot out of the water, so it's pretty low in the water. But you can imagine the size of these ships, especially when they had, 50, 60 cannons on board, at least 30 on each side. Here's an old Ironside, and it's still the oldest commissioned ship of the United States Navy from 1795. And you can see the fighting tops over there. This is the picture of the Niagara breaking the British line, fired on both sides. Cannons going off that way and cannons going off that way. And it actually, by having that ship in a strange way coming up later, it actually was intact. All of his cannons were working. Fresh Marines providing firepower. So, in a strange way, it won the battle, even though it came up late, because it was a fresh ship. This is the gun deck of the Constitution. You can see the size of these cannons. These are mostly 32 pounders. So that when they say 32 pounder, that means the ball weighs 32 pounds. That is incredible. And they would be racked up like this on the rack. It's kind of a dark shot though. This is a carronade, and just like any other war, the technology is the thing that wins. And this is an American invention. It's a carronade. The Americans used to call them smashers. And these were a very short barrel cannon, but they had terrific firepower called carronades. They were much, they could really break up the wood on the ship in no time at all. This shows you the loading of the carronade. And this is over at the Erie Maritime Museum. Notice what one cannonball can do. They actually took one of the panels of the ship out in the backyard, and they actually fired some 24 and 32 pounders to show the public what the splinters would look like. And this was the cause of most of the injuries on the ship, was the splinters of wood. There was one Marine who was, I read his pension from the government, and he actually had a splinter that went from his shoulder and exited out of his thigh, right through his body. And it's like a very sharp, big toothpick. You can see the effect. Now this is probably a 12-pounder or a 6-pounder, but imagine what a larger bore cannon could do. And most of the soldiers, the sailors, or the Marines would wrap their heads with rags because the sound of the gunpowder going off was just deafening, and all the splinters on the ground. This is the Perry Victory Monument, and below the monument are six buried soldiers. I think there's 4 Americans, including Lieutenant Brooks, and 2 British. This is called the International Peace Monument. And since then, there's been nothing but peace between Canada and the United States, and that's what that monument is about. There's a typical camp of reenactors. This happens to be a British camp. You can tell by the red coats. And they have straw, just like we had here last week. This is to keep it nice and snug and warm. During the Revolutionary War, this little wedge would actually hold about 6 soldiers. They would all sleep this way. So when time to roll over, they'd all roll over. So when time to roll over, they'd all roll over that way. So, because wagons and horses were expensive commodities, so everyone had any chance to go around. This is Simon Girty. This is taken over in Amherstburg. He was an Indian fighter, and he fought for the British. I'm sorry, he wasn't an Indian fighter. He was an Indian fighter against the Americans, and he portrays Simon Girty. And I think the word dirty came from his last name, Gertie. Because, dirty became a word, an adjective that, it was against something. So, like dirty this or dirty that. And I think he was the origin of that term. The Indians were basically dressed to scare the enemy. That's why they would do things like this. And when they went into battle, they would generally have a lot of black or white. That was their symbology for death. This is one of the watercolors from the Navy Yard at Amherstburg, near Fort Malden, right next to Fort Malden, where they built the ships, and Detroit is right across the way. There's another view of Fort Malden and the Navy Yard. They were also building a ship for reenacting called HMS Detroit, because when they captured Detroit, they called the ship HMS Detroit in honor of that British victory. And here's one of the Canadian ships, fully manned, on the Detroit River. This is the Battle of the Thames I was telling you about, where the British were in open formation and the Indians were in the swamp, guarding the right flank with Tecumseh. And when they said, remember the raisin, they went right through that thing. They had a term that was called a forlorn hope. That was an early American term. And that is the first troop of cavalry to attack the British Indians were called the Forlorn Hope. And that was they generally picked about 20 men. It was a suicide mission. They generally picked about 20 men, and they knew that they were going to take all the hits from all the musket fire. So they probably weren't going to come back. But they wanted to do that to sap all the muskets of the British to go off, and then the next wave would go right through their ranks, and that's what actually happened. Forlorn hope. There's a view of the American Army, and we do some of these battles that involve 500 on each side. They're quite realistic, especially when you have cannons. One of the largest reenactments that we do is in Mississippi. If you ever get down to Marion, Indiana, it's a winter Indian fight, and takes place always the first or second week in October. And I've never seen so many cannons and Indians and American Army, the British Army. They're all there. You can see they would close to about, those muskets would actually be quite lethal at about 50 yards. But they're not accurate. They were smoothbore. So as a result, if I was to aim there, I would actually hit somebody a foot to the right or a foot to the left. So they almost had like a 9-foot square firing pattern. Here's those Kentucky troops that I promised you I'd show. This is what they wore. The uniforms were very expensive. The country was only 36 years old, so they actually wore these frocks. They call them frock coats, blue with red trim. And it was also a psychological thing too, because they knew that the British were very afraid of these kinds of soldiers. Because during the American Revolution, Morgan's men all wore these frock coats, and with the Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifle. The British called those weapons the best widowmaker in North America. So they knew the Americans were crack shots, and they wore those uniforms for that effect. This is where Tecumseh was shot at the Battle of the Thames. This is a Marine battle drum with the 15 stars. I painted about 3 of these drums. And these are the 6 battles that the Marine Corps honors, makes recognition of. Fort George was on Lake Ontario. Trainee Island, which is down Norfolk, that was the first time the Marines actually pushed back a complete battalion of Royal Marines into the water. So that was quite a feat. And then the Battle of Lake Erie. And here's the Marines in Fort George. And they would, these are the barracks at Fort George, which is Niagara Lake, which is a beautiful village just south of Toronto. And the British would actually have, these were firing points. The Americans did the same thing, so that they could actually, at the Battle of Sackett's Harbor, which you can pick up, which is in the back there, they talk about how the Marines were being pressed by the British, and the British were pushing their muskets in here, and the Marines were shooting out, and it was hand-to-hand between these firing ports. It was a very, very intense battle. This is storming of the fort. This is the Battle of King Island, where the Marines pushed back the Italian Royal Marines. And here's the other side of the drum. This is Bladensburg. This is where the Marines got overrun by the British. They were very poorly led by American officers at that time. And the British went on and burnt Washington. This is the Battle of Lake Champlain, where the second British fleet was captured by the Americans. Totally amazing. And this is the Battle of New Orleans, which is so unusual because the Battle of New Orleans was actually fought after the peace treaty was signed. But communication was so slow that 8,000 British got killed for nothing. I think the American losses were only 11. And you'll see why. This is that Chesapeake area that they came into when they burnt Washington. And here's Bladensburg, which is just about a mile. And there's an island over here, Tangier Island, which was the base for the British. They always like to stop at an island and form up, have lunch or dinner, and then get the troops ready, and then do the battle. They were big on that. The surgeons didn't like that at all, because the worst thing to do is to work on a soldier with a full stomach. And this is where the Battle of Bladensburg talks about where the Marines stood their ground. Battlefield. And here's what the Marines distinguished themselves at the Battle of Bladensburg. They were working these guns. These look like 24-pounders. And this is one of the Colonel Waterhouse that would be going into the boat. And they would actually fight their battles with these woolen dress blue uniforms. That was their battle uniform. Kind of unusual. This was a lucky shot that I took at the Fort McHenry. If you ever go to Fort McHenry, they actually replicate the bombardment of Fort McHenry with Old Glory. I don't know if this is Old Glory or the other side, but they actually, the U.S. Army actually does the bombardment, which is unbelievable. I mean, that any American could stand that bombardment, and then they ended up with fireworks. So I kind of thought that was kind of cool with the flag and the fireworks. This is the Battle of Plattsburgh or Lake Champlain. That was also on the battle drum. And this is where the American line was. This is the Battle of Lake Champlain. The Americans were lined up over here, and the British came from Canada along that way. And the reason why the Americans won the battle is always based on technology. The side that has the best technology is going to win, just like today. The Desert Storm, we had night vision, we had tanks that could shoot, 2-3 miles away. They didn't have any of that. So the reason why we won this battle is because the Americans had, before the battle, they wanted the British to come to them. So that's why they were lined up over there. So, and their ships were on springs. Now what that means on springs is that beforehand, they would drop a second anchor over there with a long rope. And then when that whole side was either decimated by cannon fire or battle, then they could turn the ship around. And they could bring new guns to bear. And that's called springs. So we got the fresh cannons and fresh crew to wage the second part of the battle. And the British didn't have that. So that's how we won that. Here's a typical British Army. And most of these men were taken from the docks. They were, they had press gangs back then. And they had the entire, during the Revolution, the officers would have their entire family. When we captured them at the Battle of the Thames and another battle there, Chillicothe, Ohio was the capital at that time. And the officers, I think there were about 20 women and 6 children that were also there, along with captured Indians. So they would actually have their entire family move along with them. And the Americans, during the American Revolution, we would have the entire family also. The women would act as laundresses and cooks, and the children would act as nurses and bring water onto the battlefield, and son would maybe move up into becoming ensign or a junior officer. So the whole family took part, which was kind of an interesting idea because it took a lot of wagons, a lot of horses to transport all those people. You might have 3,000 soldiers and you have to get 15,000 people because you got everybody else that come along with them. This is the British, this is up in Penetanguishene. The Canadians and the British, they considered the American very warlike. So they quit their base at Amherstburg and Fort Malden, and they went on the other side of Lake Huron at a new base called Penetanguishene. And there's a British base. It's in the Georgian Islands. So that's their new base. And the Americans and the Marines tried to also follow them on Lake Huron, but they didn't have a guide who knew and it was too many islands, they could not find a base, otherwise they would burn it. But they did burn one schooner supply ship, the Nancy, which is still over there. This was President Jefferson's invention, which was kind of like a total bust. Jefferson was a pacifist, and that was one of the things that was an outcome of the war, 1812. And that is that the British had 1,000 ships. These were big minnow wars. These were things that had 110 cannons on them. And Jefferson had this one cannon on these barges, and he built about 400 of these barges. And he had this idea that one cannon could go up against the British ship because they could maneuver faster around them and do damage. Well, that idea didn't work too well. This is the Battle of New Orleans, which actually people think it just happened, on Christmas and January 8th, but actually this entire Gulf area took up about a month because Andy Jackson, Old Hickory, he also captured Mobile and he also captured western Florida. So this battle was going on for a long time. And they had Tennessee after Kentucky. Tennessee was the other state that furnished the most men into the battle. And this is the Natchez Trace. This is where most of the men from Tennessee would come down for the battle. And if you've ever taken this is now a highway. It's a phenomenal trip. It's unbelievable. It goes from Nashville all the way to Mississippi, Natchez, Mississippi, called the Natchez Trace. The cavalry would move on barges. This is some of General Jackson's staff. We did this for the History Channel, where we put this together. And we do quite a few things for the History Channel. I've spoken on the History Channel because we have all the uniforms, all the gear, etc. This is the Marines building the entrenchments in front of Flying Jackson. One of Colonel Waterhouse's pictures. This is the 7th U.S. Infantry. They have leather shakos, and these guys are called, to this day, they're still, their descendants, they're still going on, and they're called cotton balers, because at the Battle of New Orleans, they fought behind cotton balers. So that is their regimental nickname now, the cotton balers. And the Marines fought next to them at the Battle of New Orleans. And we mostly fought against Highlanders, the Americans would take out their officers first, and then the Highlanders, there's a book, or there's a narrative that I read where it's called, They're Coming at Us on All Fours, because after their officers were killed, these guys were crawling on all fours to get away from the American fire. This is what we put together for the History Channel for the Battle of New Orleans. And these are some of the Kentucky and Tennessee troops. Now these guys, they really smell. This is one of the illustrations from the Battle of New Orleans. You can see the Marines there with the white belts. And there's a whole mixture. They had Creoles, they had Black Americans, they had Spaniards, they had everybody. There's the British coming at them. There were, I think, close to 15,000 British. And it didn't look very good at all. But the Americans won the day. Better shots and having that rampart. The reason the British lost this battle is because one of the outfits, one of the regiments was supposed to carry fascines. Now fascines are bundles of twigs, like 4 foot long by like this much, and each guy was supposed to carry one of them. And the regiment might have 1,200 men. So they were supposed to carry those bundles of wood and throw them into the ditch so that the British could climb over. Well, I think Jackson's night battle kind of prevented them, from sleeping, and the fascines never got made, or they forgot to carry them, what have you. When we do the Battle of New Orleans, we do a candlelight tour, which is really unusual because they have these little vignettes. The Marines were guarding President Jackson, and they do these things like a little bonfire, and they have these little vignettes throughout the whole campsite. So it's the fact that it's dark outside, it makes like a real time capsule. It's like really real. It's so good. And they brought in a British prisoner, and General Jackson was interrogating him. And the public is all watching, and they had about 50 people around each of the little campfires watching the scenario. And the British soldiers would not tell us what regiments were facing for the day before. And in the meantime, they got this big 24-pounder cannon going off because Jackson, he hated the British, and he said they will not sleep on American ground. So he had this cannon going off every hour, just so they couldn't sleep. And so they couldn't get the British soldier to talk, so Jackson said, well, take him for a little ride behind the patrol, and maybe the alligators will get him to talk. So then, when the guy knew that he was going to get keel hauled behind the little flatboat, he started talking right away. This was all planned in the scenario, and the crowd went really competitive. Well, this is one of the Longhouse pictures. This is the when they tried to overrun the Marines. Can you imagine the year they had to fight with that flour and wigs and all that? And once they picked off their officers, the Highlanders didn't have a chance at all. And this is some of the Highlanders that we shot for the History Channel in front of Line Jackson. There's the American line right over here. And this is, we're kind of coming to a close now. This is this is the first Marine flag that we found. The government didn't even know what it was. I found this at the Smithsonian in a corner, not even lit, not even any explanation. And here it says from terror to something, in other words, from land and sea. And here's the eagle and the anchor. And over here it says, the shorts of Tripoli, Hall of Montezuma. They didn't even know if that was a Marine flag. Now they got it lit up, and now there's a big sign saying what it is. You see how it works? And this is, I go as far in the book as far as the Hall of Montezuma. We kind of end there. The book is also entitled From the Shores of Tripoli to the Halls of Montezuma, 1805 to 1848. So it'll end on a Mexican note. And there's our flag. And these are what some Civil War Marines look like. You can still see they have the White Cross belts. And they also captured John Brown. These are Marines taking that fire station with John Brown, and that assault party was led by, I don't know if he was a captain or a colonel, but Robert E. Lee. He led the Marines on the assault on John Brown. And that's the award that we won for historical excellence from the Marine Corps for Marine history. And those are my turkeys grilling for Thanksgiving. That's it.